Hey everyone, Matt's here with another chess opening. This is the Queen's Gambit opening. More specifically, this video is going to talk about the accepted line of the Queen's Gambit. The Queen's Gambit starts out the same with every line. It's pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and pawn to c4. This opening is very common in top level play. So it's a good idea to get familiar with the lines at least a little bit. The accepted line continues with this pawn capturing on c4, and it's called a gambit because white does offer a pawn that is unprotected to black to take. But the Queen's Gambit, unlike all the other gambits in chess, is not a true gambit because black cannot hold on to this pawn no matter how hard they try. And we'll go over how to prevent black from holding on to this pawn in just a moment, but the main line continues with pawn to e3, just getting ready for this bishop to capture the pawn to regain the material. And black, again, you won't see them try to hold on to this pawn normally because most players either know that the pawn cannot be held onto, or they have already tried in the past and have found out that they can't the hard way. So play will continue. Black just keeps on developing, moving knight to f6. White will now just recapture the material. Black can now play pawn to e6, getting ready to develop this bishop so that they can then castle on the king side. Next you'll see knight to f3 from white, getting ready to castle king side as well. And this is the main line. Next you'll probably see the bishop develop, maybe to e7, or to another square so that they can castle, and white will then castle on the following turn or develop a knight. And this is the main line of the Queen's Gambit accepted. And as said previously, sometimes black might try to hold on to this pawn, and if you see that, make black pay for trying to do so, because it cannot be done without putting black in a very tight situation. And we'll look at that now. So this is a variation where black tries to hold on to the pawn. We have this right here, the Queen's Gambit accepted. Pawn to e3, getting ready to recapture. And one thing you might see is pawn to b5 from black, trying to put a defender on this pawn. But now white can play pawn to a4, attacking this pawn. If this pawn captures, this pawn is now unguarded again. If this pawn moves forward, again, this pawn is unguarded. And there's no way to hold on to both of these pawns. If white wants to defend this pawn with maybe bishop to e3, e6, excuse me, then this pawn will fall. And if they try to hold on to this pawn, then this pawn will eventually fall as well. So one thing you might see black do is move pawn to a6, thinking that this pawn will be defending this pawn after the capture. But now once white captures this pawn is pinned to the rook because of our rook that is now pinning the pawn. So that pawn is no good. The other movement, which I'm going to play here, is pawn to c6, but this falls into a trap, and it goes as follows: pawn captures pawn, and now queen to f3, hitting this unprotected rook. The only way to save the rook is by giving up a minor piece, and that is with the knight coming to c6, the queen capturing the knight, the bishop coming to d7, and now the rook is safe, but white is now up a knight, and so black is down in material. Black held on to the pawn but lost the knight, so it's going to be a fairly easy game for white from here. So that is not a line that you will see very often. Another line you might see is pawn takes pawn, pawn up, getting ready to recapture. The bishop coming to e6, trying to hold on to this pawn, knowing that this pawn can't come here. But now white can play knight to a3, which seems like a very awkward spot to put the knight, but it is putting a second attacker on this pawn. So that's going to make white have to put yet another defender on the pawn, such as moving the queen up to d5, putting an additional attack, a defender on this pawn. But now white can just play something like the knight coming to e2, getting ready to come here to attack the queen, which is going to take off another defender. So now black, to hold on to this pawn, which is what he's trying to do, needs to play pawn to b5 so that black has another defender once this queen gets chased away. The problem with this now is that this pawn is only defended by the queen. So now when the knight comes to f4 attacking the queen has to stay where she can defend this pawn. One place you might see the queen move is over to f5. This is not a main line. I actually just use Fritz at this point to just see where Fritz put the queen to see for the best position. And now the knight can just capture the bishop. If the queen captures the knight, this pawn falls from our knight, so we regain the material, and threatening to take more material later, since this pawn is going to not have any support from any other pawn. So the correct move from here is to capture with this pawn, which is messing up. Now both the queen and the king side is weakened for black, so that's one thing. Black has doubled pawns, and now white can just play pawn to b3, putting another attacker on this pawn. To maintain the material, because once pawn catches pawn, white will still be able to recapture here to gain the material. So now black has to capture this pawn in order to maintain material. But now white can just capture this pawn on b5 and is threatening to capture this pawn with taking the rook. There's no way to defend this pawn without moving the king. The queen has nowhere to move to defend this pawn. And so the king now is just going to have to move over. So now the king can't castle. The king's going to be very unsafe. This pawn is already ready to be picked off, and so the material is regained. And so as you can see, there's really no way for black to hold on to the material, and normally you will see black just let go of the material and develop as normal. The last thing you'll see in the Queen's Gambit, besides the decline lines, which I'll go over in a moment, is called the Alban counter gambit. Besides going to the main line of the Queen's Gambit, black can actually put up a counter gambit, which instead of capturing or declining, which we'll go over in a moment, black can now play pawn to e5, offering up this pawn as a counter gambit to the Queen's Gambit. And the main line for this just runs as the pawn on d captures on e, pawn on d5 moves up to d4 so that this pawn's no longer pressuring it, and now both player develops not to f3 and not to c6. And this is the gist of about how the Alban counter gambit goes. So black gave up a pawn in order to double these pawns and to avoid going through the accepted or decline lines of the Queen's Gambit. The other lines to keep in mind for the Queen's Gambit are the decline lines, which I will go over in another video, but they look like this. It's pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, and now black has two options. Black can play pawn to e6, supporting this pawn. This is the Slav defense variation. Or black can play pawn to c6, and this is the semi-Slav variation. Both of those openings are very have a lot of depth to them, and there's not enough time in this video to go over them. So there will be more videos that will be specified to those. So anyway, I hope you found this video useful, and maybe you can try this out in your own game. It's a really strong opening, and thanks for watching.